you everyone for joining us this evening. This is thank you everyone for joining us this evening. This is our second seminar in the InfUr seminar series for 2024. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and just to acknowledge that this land has never been ceded. It's my great pleasure to introduce Sabina Andron, who's going to be giving us a seminar this afternoon on semiotic informality on urban surfaces. My understanding is that Sabina has been on a world tour recently, talking about a recent book that has just come out, and we're delighted, hopefully, to hear a little bit more about your work and the book itself. Sabina is a specialist in urban visual culture. She's the author of Urban Surfaces, Graffiti, and the Right to the City, which just came out last year, and research fellow at the Melbourne Centre for Cities, which is here at the University of Melbourne. Sabina is going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. If you're joining us online, just put your questions or comments in the chat, and I'll do my best to facilitate that. And if you're here with us face-to-face, our practice is typically to go to the Clyde Hotel for a drink and to carry the conversation on afterwards. So Sabina, without further ado.
Lovely. Can people online hear me? Yeah, okay, great. Thanks for having me here. I feel quite privileged to be part of this forum, so thank you for that. I'm going to share my screen first. So this full screen, that looks good. And then I'm going to circulate this little object for you to check out and hold. Some people have seen this before, I know. So this is a bit of urban surface that I recovered from London's most prolific legal graffiti area. So it's actually a slab made out of several hundreds, I would say, of layers of spray paint. So yeah, just check this out. And I'm going to start by reading the very, very last page of my book, which is a manifesto called "The Right to the City is the Right to the Surface." The right to the surface is unique but manifold. Its energy is singular, yet its traction comes from multitudes. The right to the surface is a right to visibility, inclusion, and participation. The right to be clear and to be here. The right to the surface is a right to appropriation and use, irrespective of ownership entitlements and property certificates. Its authority is self-validating and empowering. A right to spatial production and enactment of dissent, and an enfranchisement for the urban dweller in front of corporate and institutional interests. The right to the surface is a contestation of private property and a production of spaces for collective use. It is a moral and political claim to access and participation, hijacking and appropriation. It is a right to break the law. The right to the surface is additive and productive, not selective and exclusive. It is the right of more, of all, to write, show, and be seen, instead of none or a selected few. The right to the surface will not be institutionalized. It is claimed, not granted. It is direct and not representative. The right to the surface does not depend on aesthetics or harmony. It is processual and formative. It seeks change and movement, not stability and permanence. It is a right to risk, not to safety. The right to refuse and confuse ideas about beauty and value, and to produce an active surface politics. The right to surface territories as political achievements. The right to the surface is a right to write, to create, to make space. It is a right to non-reconciliation and disagreement. It is a right of power and not of immunity. It grants the authority to inscribe, and it does not offer protection against inscription. It is a liberty right, and it entitles confrontation between subjectivities. The sticker, the crack, the writer, the scroll, the message, and the hybrid, alongside the title to govern, the owner, the fence, the law, and the capital. It is a right against spatial enclosure and privatization, a right of action and not of suppression. The right to the surface is a right to discourse and sociability. It is a right to stay nameless and uncategorizable. The right to the surface is a right to sign and a right to the sign. It is an expression of possibility, potential, alternative, heterogeneity, and future. A right to struggle and belonging, to simultaneity and encounter, a right to incoherence. The right to the surface is the right to produce urban art, to decide the image of the city, and to contest its regimes of regulation. It is the right to become and to remain minor, mundane, categoryless, and anesthetic. The right to the surface stacks, delights, annoys, undermines, and empowers. The right to the surface is a right to unpoliced displays and to value surfaces as archives of urban cultures. The right to the surface is the right to the city. So the way I've structured this is in 3 parts. To think a bit about semiotics and to explore what I mean by semiotics and how I engage with semiotics in my work on the surfaces of the city. Then I'm going to speak a bit about law and how law deals with surfaces and the problem of the surface. And then I'm going to try to speak a bit about justice and also to explain how justice is different from law and how I understand it here. This work forms part and draws from several theoretical strands, but I would just like to mention this to begin, which is a sociology of walls as it was defined by Italian sociologist Andrea Mubi-Briganti in this book, but also in a previous publication from 2009 called The Wall in the City, in which he proposes looking at walls, not just as architects often do, separation devices and technologies, but also looking at walls as sites of display and analyzing their communicative potential. So I'll start with looking at semiotics for a bit. So I've defined in the book this idea of inscription, so the different ways in which the surfaces of cities are used to communicate things, public signage. So I wanted to kind of incorporate several aspects into this definition to say that surface inscriptions are interdependent, toposensitive image language signs. So interdependent, they depend on one another and on their context. That's the toposensitive, they respond to their context, right? Always the context of their materiality, the context of their political governance situation, and their image language. And this was, I think, came on quite early in my research when I started looking at graffiti and realizing that often it was analyzed as either a type of image or a type of text, but not both of them together. And I want to say that the categories are quite muddled, at least in the way I've researched this. I'm going to read through this list. Commercial posters, traffic signs, street artworks, text and image signs, stickers, activist posters, scratches, shop signs, advertising murals, municipal signage, commercial billboards, graffiti tags, community notice boards, computer-generated images on construction site hoardings, discarded leaflets, artistic murals, historical lettering, political slogans, commercial banners, brands and logos of places and products, utility markings, warning and cautionary signs, property boundary markers, location markers, serial numbers, names of utility suppliers and infrastructure maintenance providers, drawings, splashes of paint, safety notices, protest signs, LED screens, placards, product labels, registration plates, price tags, commemorative and heritage plaques, addresses and street and house numbers, building and institution names, and of course the list goes on. So this is kind of the communicative universe of inscriptions, the semiotic universe of surfaces. And of course, there are material dimensions to this. Many of the images I'm going to show you are annotated, and this forms part of my methodology of working through semiotics and unpacking the semiotics of surfaces and its multiple dimensions. And again, following Briganti, the concept of surfaceality, not just verticality, when looking at urban walls. So kind of understanding what are the features of these barriers that enclose, one would say, public space, right? Enclose open space, negative space. And what are their material features? What are their communicative display, but also political and legal features? So we'll get to that in the later part of the presentations. Another concept that was useful for me when I set up is the concept of geosemiotics. This is where that comes from. A book that was really influential for me, particularly when I started this research, because, and again, for those of you who are familiar with semiotic theory and the semiotic trial proposed by Peirce, who says there are 3 types of signs. I don't want to get into that now, but what this theory says is that you cannot understand signs if you don't look at where they are, or like you will understand them inaccurately or partially. So the same sign can mean something very different depending on its context. It's a very basic thing, but again, it can lead to quite nuanced interpretations as we go. Recently revisited Learning from Las Vegas and found it fantastic, including one concept that they use, which they talk about mega texture, which I found was very interesting. Of course, they use it in relation to this landscape, but I think we can use it at different scales, looking at walls and surfaces. There is something about publicness and the development of publicness that historians write about in relation to public writing. So arguing that even if the early forms of public writing that defined the modern city, which were mostly commercial and private endeavors, in their multiplicity, they ended up forming a public. And even if they weren't publicly formulated or addressed in the way that we would think about it today, they nevertheless contributed to the formation of literacy and to a shared sense of space and identity as well. So in a way, we can say that written cities are public cities, and this is a value that in my thinking and in my research is kind of absolute. So it doesn't matter what type of writing. If there is diverse writing there, that is a sign of publicness. So we have scenes like this of bill posters. And this is one of the direction in which my research is going now, looking at the history of bill posting, because I'm looking at what's happening now in Melbourne. But I want to just try and suggest, okay, this is a landscape of writing, linguistic landscape. It's a field of study, looking at the sum of writings in a particular area to understand its culture, right? Although it kind of excludes the image component. But if we understand this as a linguistic landscape, this is a landscape of tags, right? This is also a linguistic landscape. But can I ask you to think through these 2 images in a non-differentiated way, and again to go to the core of how exactly do we formulate, legislate, interpret this differently from this, and why in principle, and maybe, you know, individually we disagree at this, but at least in the way that we set up our societies and urban governance and governance of images and text, right? This is acceptable and this is not. And they're just a collection of names. But also mega texture, right? Zooming out a bit. This is a photo from Brussels, which I quite like on a more symbolic level, because I think it's quite interesting how the graffiti occupies kind of the underbelly here, but also how there are different types of textures that get created. And which in turn form urban atmospheres and identities. And it's something that we can read from surfaces. I just wanted to show you this project as well, which I completed a few years ago. This is in Leek Street, where that bit of wall comes from. And this is a succession of photos taken every weekday. So it's not very accurate saying it's 100 days. It's 100 weekdays of Leek Street. But this is the turnover of the space on a daily basis. And now you can probably understand why that accumulated so easily, actually, in this space. But there's something here for me. Okay, I've made arguments in relation to this about the importance of having this kind of space and how graffiti is a social activity and how it is productive of space. But I want us here to think about how it's productive of space quite literally. It makes a new space. That is a new space that didn't exist before. It's a volume. The surface is volume. So then if the surface is volume, what are the implications? What are the legal implications of that? What are the implications in terms of urban inhabitation, spatial production, property ownership, the defense of private property? So these are some of the things that I explore in my work. And there's more of these. I have 10 different ones that I took. So, so this, well, okay, that's image, text, semiotics, texture. But I want to draw us a bit closer to materiality now and to matter. And to offer you this beautiful quote by Tim Ingold, where from a paper in which he writes about how to research surfaces and the importance of researching surfaces. A theory of surfaces that practices what it preaches must not only raise being up from the depths, but also take knowing down from the heights. It must join with the texture of the world, with its materials and processes, answering to them as they to it. The practice of theory, in short, must be a modality of habitation, a way of thinking and working with stuff on a level with the materials of its trade. And something that's been very important to me, and I've realized this more recently as well, in terms of how I position myself as a researcher, is proximity. I can only in my head do valid research if I'm there. I don't know how to write about something that is remote, or like a wall that I can't touch or be with in a way. And this is something we might discuss about because I know some of you work in completely different ways. But for me, this has been consistently something that's important. This is a photo of torn posters, essentially the remnants of advertising posters on tube platform that I took. I took this photo. And this is a photo from a bunch of years earlier of an artwork that was made as part of this movement called of French artists who call themselves the New Realists. And what they were doing was they were working with this process of décollage, so the opposite of collage. So they were literally, it's found objects, right, in a way, removing posters from the surfaces of the city, altering them, but only to certain extents, and putting them on gallery walls. And it's also a commentary on the visual and material culture of capital and advertising, but also this gives texture to the city in the end, especially when it falls apart. So these are interesting spaces for me because here the communicative function and even the function of the typology of the billboard has completely fallen apart, but we're still left with a space that's productive of a type of occupation, materiality, that I want to argue this falling apart is a form of justice, and it happens on every surface if we look close enough. I'll get us there by the end of the talk. Photo from Melbourne from last year. Another one of the works of the decolagists. I don't comment anymore, but I think you get the picture. So there are several operations and things that happen. In the book, I made a list of things surfaces do and things done to surfaces. And I've been working recently here in Melbourne with graffiti removal workers, and trying to understand how they see the city. And of course, we've all seen these, like the cleaning patches, how they paint over graffiti, and how, again, this is a productive gesture. And if we think about it, then maybe there are a lot of symmetries between writing graffiti and covering it in terms of the operations, the materials, the knowledges that each of them entails. So these are some of the things done to surfaces. But there are also other concepts and dimensions that I've used in my research and that I think we can use when examining surfaces such as these. And I wanted particularly for the architects in the room to just quickly mention this bit of research, which is quite fresh. And Adam Hudek, he's an architect, but also an artist and a practitioner. He's doing a lot of work now with this concept of biopatina and epidermic texture. So looking at organic occupations of architectural surfaces and how they should be considered even part of architectural heritage. And therefore, instead of trying to remove them all the time and to clean and whitewash surfaces, they should be kind of kept and incorporated in our models of how we define architectural heritage. And of course, matter does its own thing. There are many non-human factors that contribute to making surfaces, humidity, sunlight, wind, and so on. Particularly in relation to posters, the friability of this material makes them particularly vulnerable, but also there's a lot in the life cycle of how these sites are maintained. This is very interesting research for me right now because it also speaks of how we extract value from surfaces, rent value, financial value, but how the materiality of these has to be maintained in a very specific way. But of course, again, it already falls apart. So this is kind of one of the main takeaways, I guess. It's however closely we plan it, it always already falls apart, and that's great because that's a sign of allowing for multiplicity. Again, I'll get to that in a second. But a final note here on text. I just wanted to show you this. It's the first time I'm publicly mentioning that I've been doing this. This is part of a project I've been running to walk down the Brunswick stretch of Sydney Road and write down all the names. Literally all the names and some of the voices, some of the text as well. Initially, I wanted to write down all the text, but it's kind of impossible to do because you find the restaurant menu and that's it. But this is the letter A of that project. It's done. I've done it. Obviously, if I were to do it again, it would be a new collection, and that's part of the beauty of this. I'm going to make an exhibition with this. I'm going to turn it into something. I'm not sure what yet. There's about 3,000 entries in total. And I think there's something about the flattening of you don't know which one is the tag, you don't know which one is the shop name, you don't know which one is the street name or the utility provider. Kind of Georges Perec, if you're familiar with his work and how he writes about space and the idea of making lists and flattening hierarchies of space, that interested me here. But this was also an interesting exercise of examining surfaces and signage and semiotics without the visual element, because I use the visual so much in my work, but this was me trying to get myself to do something without using any visual. Okay, moving on to law. This part of the research started by looking at how the law deals with graffiti in different places. I looked particularly at the UK, which was my context at the time. So how law defines graffiti, but then also how these definitions are enforced. So therefore, how surfaces are formulated, even literally how the law defines surfaces and what is a relevant surface. This is the parlance of UK policy. So any writing, letter, picture, device, or representation, painting, writing, soiling, marking, or other defacing by whatever means, etching, obliterating, displaying, and scratching. And in the University of Melbourne definition of graffiti, which came out a few months ago when there were some incidents that they wanted to address, they added to this, they basically said that is not removable by wiping with a dry cloth. So that if you can remove it with a dry cloth, then it's not technically graffiti. So chalk kind of doesn't count, which is interesting given the kind of semiotics of the campus right now, actually, if you think about that. So what is the hierarchy, the legal hierarchy of these two inscriptions? This is supposed to be there, whereas this is not. But again, I'd like us to question why. And this is going, I think, back to ideas of informality and how there is something about why certain spaces are defined. Why are we saying this is informal and this is not? Why are we saying this is unacceptable and this is? But also to think about how the removal of graffiti can be a creative process and is in many instances deliberately creative in itself. And it's a kind of maintenance labor that has many implications beyond the letter of the law, as it were. And here, hugely influential, the work of, for me, the work of Andreas Philippopoulos Michalopoulos and his book on spatial justice, in which he defines spatial justice as the struggle between bodies to occupy the same space at the same time. So, and he proposes this concept of the lawscape, and I know Alison's here, and she wrote about this a lot, obviously about all of this, and this concept of the lawscape, which I know she uses in her work as well, is kind of trying to understand how law and space cannot exist separately from each other. This is how Andreas Philippopoulos Michalopoulos kind of proposes this. But of course, sometimes this is visible, tangible, sometimes it's not. Here, I like this example in particular because semiotically, there's two ways of communicating this prohibition here. There's the text, please do not urinate here. There's the design structure, which is meant to actually prevent the act of urination. And of course, someone did it. It's always already falling apart. And so what I talk about in the book, and there's an entire chapter about this, law and graffiti, is how surfaces kind of in that thickening, they complicate. Surfaces are recruited for two main things in cities. The protection of private property, and the regulation of public order. We do this through signage, but we also do this through the fact that you're not allowed, right? Any remarking, soiling of someone else's property is a criminal act. So you're not supposed to mark something that's not yours. But surfaces, because they are materially thick, they complicate both these regimes. And then they kind of, the way I like to think about it is quite spatial again. So they kind of like press, if surfaces would be compressed to very thin single membranes by both of these legal regimes, they kind of press from the middle and they try to make more space. And they do make more space. And that's a just space, I try to argue. So there's ideas of property and propriety here, and lots of different layers, hidden layers that happen. Okay, I don't want to explain this too much. I think legal analysis can be a semiotic layer as well in terms of how we interpret surfaces, and sometimes that's how I use it. But of course, you know, again, there's weird things that happen. So here, for example, because of health and safety concerns, graffiti removal workers are not allowed to go higher. If they don't have equipment, they can't go higher than their bodies can reach. And so there's instances like this when like half the work gets cleaned and the other half stays. This is a photo I took here in Melbourne with Richard, who was out cleaning this shop on Sydney Road, and he had to come at it with different layers of intervention to get off the posters first with a high pressure wash, and then to come with chemicals to dilute the graffiti, the spray paint. But also this is super interesting because this is the shedding of the surface. These are the layers that are now on the ground, but they are the ones that form the thickness of this space. This photo is from a graffiti removal training facility, which is a thing that exists, and Australia, Melbourne, because of this man here, has the biggest one in Australia. And it's an amazing warehouse kind of space where they have real world props. So there's, you know, rubbish bins and playground equipment and signage, of course. And here Greg was doing a demo for me to show how he manufactures graffiti removal chemicals. So he'll say, you know, like half the sign, it's like those old like TV shopping ads, you know, like look, the knife that cuts through a tomato. Or like, so it's like this half was treated with this product and the other half was treated with that product. And they have this fantastic manual as well, which is you know, like I can't remember now, it's just like a ultimate guide to surfaces or something like that. And this is from fieldwork with another graffiti removal worker. This is him, Adrian. People who were at my book launch got to meet Adrian. And this is something he did. So this wall is by the train line. I'm sure many of you will know this wall. It's a wall of Brunswick bats on the upfield bike path. And it's kind of his bugbear, this wall, and he tries different things on it. And so he's using this paint, but then you can see him here with the bucket of like this light blue paint that he had left over from another project. So he tried to do like this more creative thing. And he just painted on the column there, on the pillar. And it's quite interesting to think about how he engages with this, again, beyond just the letter of the law, as it were. I just briefly want to mention this project, which I haven't done yet. I got an ECR grant for it last year, and I'm in the process of dealing with ethics right now for this, which I've almost cleared the Australian ethics. It's the Ugandan ethics now that is like, whew. which is to look at visual cultures and public signs and surfaces in Kampala, and to try to argue for all of these things that I've been mentioning now so far as a form of heritage. And I don't know if there's an angle here of maybe informality as heritage, and maybe you can tell me more about that. But what I'd like to do is create a taxonomy. I'm going to work with some partners there, and also to argue for visual culture in general as a form of heritage, potentially. Ooh, this is going without me, but here we go. So I just have a few photos that I took in Kampala the last time I was there. This is from the National Theatre, which is a heritage listed building, fantastic modernist building. This is one of the original mosaics, and the necessary sign there. This is a civic education mural about voting. Many things happening here. Bring back our people. That's a political. Why is this suddenly going? Like it should be going. That's a political stencil which refers to some disappearances that the current regime perpetuated, but is not admitting to. The president of Uganda has been in power since '86, so you can kind of imagine the level of democracy in that country. These signs, which I found really interesting and I couldn't really understand until I asked around, and then I got the explanation that what happens was that people are pretending to own land plots and to sell them to you. So then, and many times these signs come with a phone number. And I thought, that's so weird, like land not for sale, call me, you know. But this is why, because then that's the number of the actual property owner who can verify that whoever is trying to sell the land is not a legitimate owner. But also looking at bill posters and hand-painted advertising. There's no graffiti. There's some street art because there are international street art festivals, but I find this really annoying now. Okay, I don't have many slides left, so I think we can just go with this. I'm gonna just read a couple of bits for this last part, which is on justice. And maybe try to bring in more of the concept of informality here. So spatial justice, again, going back to Andreas Philippopoulos Michalopoulos' work, he defined it as the fight between different bodies, as I said, to occupy the same space at the same time. And this is how I examine surfaces and inscriptions. But what's remarkable, I think, about surfaces is that they form a body of evidence. They store these contradictions and tensions. They store all the bodies. There's so many bodies in that bit of space there, in that bit of surface. So then they become sort of archives, material archives, visual archives of different contradictory modes of occupying and making and producing space and cities. But also, you know, through removal of layers, through addition of layers, when we cover the graffiti, we come back with another layer, and the non-human contributions to this. So they become evidence for contested values of governance and inhabitation. So what I try to do is to disconnect the legality of these occupations as it's supported by models of public order and private property, as I said, how the law deals with signage approvals and so on with surfaces, to disconnect the law from justice. Which means from the ways in which surfaces are actually used and produced in affirmation of different models of spatial occupation and visibility. So I've spoken of spatial justice and surface justice in the book. But recently I've expanded this and tried to think about visual justice. And this is a conversation piece that Lata and I published a couple of months ago, but also think about semiotic justice. what would that look like? And think about visual justice and semiotic justice as a way, a critical analysis of the ways in which public signs and images articulate values of belonging, representation, and contestation in cities. And this is a little article I wrote that will come out in the Society of Architectural Historians magazine this month, I think. Yeah, May. It's dated May. So there's something about informality as othering, or the informal as the other. And, that can be, Kim, morphological, othering, you do it through governance, socioeconomic othering. And, Renee, I saw you today looking at the China Miéville's novel, The City and the City, and Alison, you're online. You write about this in Street Art Public City, where you go, okay, there's different cities in the city. So there's kind of different spaces that we all occupy simultaneously. The legislative city, the informal city, and so on. But what I want to say is that they're one and the same. They're one and the same, and they support each other. We can't have one without the other. So informality, yes, is a feature and a mode of producing space. And there's several parallels, I think, between how informal spaces are governed and how surfaces are governed. And this is something that perhaps we should talk about. I have 5 slides to finish on, which are kind of broader statements that I want to make about why surfaces matter. One of them is, I think, that surfaces are capacities of publicness. I think that this idea of space as capacity, this is Stavros Stavridis. For me, that's where I encountered this and thinking about, and his work on urban commons. And in the book, again, I developed this concept of the surface commons, which I don't want to dwell on too much now, but it's this idea of the surface space is a sort of public capacity of cities. Their conditions of space and their typologies of space. I think if you were, I'm not an architect, but perhaps, with a bit of help from some architects, we could think about actually defining what would it mean to define surfaces as spatial typologies. They demonstrate urban character. They are evidence for urban identities and characters. And they are collaborative results of individual. This is the thing, because I don't want to make this about, it's a collective. It's not collective. It's not collective because we don't all agree, and that's why it's just, because we get to disagree. So there's individual and contradictory modes of inhabitations that are stored in the surface. And can you read this? It's well, an erased message written on this hoarding during the pandemic. This was next to my house in London, which says staying at home is class privilege. And obviously someone had to go out to clean this. And that was considered to be essential work. Which again, why? Okay, so this is what I want to come back to. Why is it that this matters so much and that we accept this and not that and so on? And my very final slide is this, which is, again, if some of you were there at the book launch, you would know this. I made some posters for the book, and I didn't put up any myself yet, although I printed some last week, which I'm planning to have a space in mind where I want to go put a couple up. But one of the poster companies that I've worked with and researched, this is within their network, and they put the posters up. So yeah, I just thought it was fun and wanted to stop on that.
That was fantastic. Sabina, thanks for that wonderful presentation. very powerful, the imagery as well as the text, and also your storytelling of your work, and your passion really came through. So it was wonderful to be present for that. Time for questions. Who would like to kick us off? Kim, and we've got a few online as well.
Well, I'd like to go first, but I've actually got
Be gentle.
one and see how many others there are. So, you know, blank walls that are available, right? And this is, in a sense, you need blank walls, and therefore, isn't the erasure of graffiti, which then creates another wall for the next round? Can that be construed as, I mean, the stuff that Ian and I wrote? Ian's come along to support me. He flew down from Sydney just stuff that we wrote. We were arguing that erasure is kind of necessary to the larger assemblage. So is periodic erasure, and even indeed a policy of erasure, some kind of spatial justice?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yes. So to my mind, it is part of the justice, the fact that, again, we're not all agreeing that we should mark more. And when I was out with Adrian, it was very interesting to hear the comments of passers-by, because they were very mixed. So some people go like, good on you, yeah, you're doing excellent job, thank you for doing that. And others go like, why would you get rid of that? Like, you know, what you're doing is not partly because, oh, you're just giving them a new canvas. That's one argument. But another argument is like, I prefer the wall before, when it was marked. So we need erasure. And if we all decided that we wanted to completely like let it rip, right? That would be equally as problematic, because we wouldn't allow space for multiple perspectives and opinions, I think. And we wouldn't enact on them, enforce them.
So when you have a complete erasure, you don't get the same kind of layering that you do when one artist adds to what the previous one has done.
It depends on how you perform the erasure. Because physically, again, if you look at matter, if you paint over, the layers are there, you know. I'm doing a photo series of white walls, and none of them are white, you know. And that's, again, like, they're available walls, they're unmarked in theory, or they're clean. But if you look at it a bit more closely, there's so much going on.
We've got a question online, and then we'll go to Patrick, can you read your question? Patrick on. There he is.
Yes, thanks so much, Krista, and thanks, Sabina, for a very interesting presentation. I am just curious to know whether, based on the work that you have done, you identify or recognize any differences in the character and purpose of urban surfaces, be it graffiti, street art, whatever form that you may be looking at, based on global North and global South experience, basically Australia, UK, and the Ugandan case that you are looking at. And do you think such variations are influenced by the level of informality across these different contexts?
Thanks, Patrick. That's a really important point, and it's part of the reason why I want to do the work in Uganda, and not just there. Like, in fact, I'm well, you know this, but I'm on a postdoc here. It's a 3-year contract, and part of the project I proposed, the project I proposed when I came here was to do exactly this, to try to understand urban visual cultures by examining surfaces, mostly non-Western contexts, to understand what the variations are and what different vocabulary we need to be able to talk about the semiotics of surfaces in non-Western contexts, because the walls look completely different, the signage is different. We need different new vocabularies and new methods. So, you know, what's the range of methods? Like this is what I'm trying to do. I can't answer this question yet, but let's speak again in 8 months.
Thanks, Patrick.
Yeah, I wanted to extend Kim's question a little bit and ask, you said something about dead, like the dead surfaces versus living surfaces, and I'm interested in that distinction between dead and living, and thinking about things like architectural dead walls where a row of buildings just ends and you're presenting either a very unconsidered front or the back of a building to passersby. And then there are, of course, people who see interventions in those walls as either a kind of form of beautification or maybe also a reaction to the architecture that's been put there. I'm wondering if you could maybe draw out the difference between dead and living walls, and also if you have more to say about this as a kind of the critique element of architecture via interventions in the surface.
Mm-hmm. Many, if not most, surfaces are designed against inscription, and those are design and technological features of the surface that architects are responsible for and planners are responsible for. And we coat surfaces, we texture them in certain ways so that they're either harder to inscribe, to paint, or easier to clean, or both. So that is one level of built-in resistance that many surfaces have. But I think there's something about, and I'm going to borrow a concept now from a colleague who she hasn't published this yet, Julia Tolk. She talks about activation and deactivation, or designing and describing for activation or deactivation, because again, I'm sure you'll be familiar with many murals that go up on buildings as a deactivating device. So you put the mural there so that the wall stays stable and inert, instead of it being subject to several voices and additions and so on. I mean, it doesn't really work. It works to a certain extent in certain instances, then there's outrage when someone goes over someone else. But I think there's something about the way, so what I'm interested in is what are the technologies that we use to try and stabilize surfaces? And then how the technologies always get subverted or, appropriated or messed with.
Ash.
Such a refreshing talk, Sabina.
Great.
I quite like the idea of, okay, so blank wall is not, a clean wall is not really a clean wall. And that kind of makes sense when you were talking about the thickening of surface, not just the material thickening, but that also relates to my last month's presentation on spatial slippages, like what are the slippages beyond the four walls of the shelters, right? So
correct.
But then you also talked about an interesting element. So that thickening of the surface, that actually tells us a lot about the spatial justice. So can you please explain a bit more on that?
So I think the way that I try to present that in the book, so why I think the thickening is evidence of justice is because it muddles the legal regimes that are meant to be exclusionary about that space. So because the law that pressed on the surface, sometimes quite literally, legally, what we know is that we're not supposed to write on the surface, we're not supposed to alter it in any way, although of course it has the life of its own that it keeps going. So the thickening is quite literal evidence for how that happens. And in the fact that private property, it comes also from contesting private property and concepts, ideas about the right to the city, and the right to the city as a right to produce space, not just use what is already there. So this is literally a form of spatial production then. It's making space where there was none. And that's why I think that is very closely associated with a production of spatial justice, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. We'll discuss more.
Yeah.
Yes.
Got time for one more question, please.
Thank you, Sabina. I'm really interested to know whether in your research you've found any types of urban spaces that are more prone to this type of communication or display, and others which are not. For example, are there any spaces that you found that rarely get posters or graffiti or informal types of communication?
It's gonna sound weird now. Say I've never really thought of this because I kind of see them everywhere. But of course, yes, there are areas where more dead surfaces, I guess. But to me, okay, let me put it another way. If I walk, safety, perception of safety, fear of crime. If I walk through an area where there aren't any tags, I feel a bit less safe because if there are tags, that is sign of, I read it as a sign of interest. I mean, you can come at this from a million angles and prove me wrong, but humor me for a second. A sign of interest that someone has, first of all, observed that space enough. Secondly, had a presence in public space is important, the presence of other humans. If there's no people around, then maybe it's not so safe. So I think when spaces don't have informal marks, first step is look for them better, because it's probable that they are there. And then second step is question, which I think we should all do all the time anyway, where the hierarchies come from, hierarchies of acceptability. And much of that is about private property. And that's why the counter is strong, I think, and valid.
I was sort of just interested in the Foucauldian concept of surveillance.
Mm-hmm.
So I was interested to understand whether spaces where there's less surveillance, for example, would be more prone to this type of communication or informality, and the reverse or not. You know, just curious.
I can't give a scientifically accurate answer now. I'm pretty sure there is research on this specifically, but you know, if you look, there's so many examples, easy to find online of like street artists, graffiti writers, subverting like the CCTV, you know, painting under the gaze of the CCTV and kind of engaging with that in playful ways and political ways. And so I would tend to say that it's unlikely that that is a deterrent. And there are many ways of surveilling as well. Obviously, it's not just the CCTV, but you'll see many times very busy streets are very busily inscribed.
So the flip side of that was, and another piece of thinking that I was interested in, if people feel well in a space, are they inclined to actually use informal communication in that space, if you understand what I'm trying to get at? So, for example, if it was an urban space that people love, do they actually then use that space to communicate in this way?
Some people do.
We do have to draw it to a close. It's a fascinating presentation and discussion, so thank you everyone for your questions. Sabina, I'm really interested in asking you questions about your writing practice and how you write with the work that you are engaging with. I love that as a concept. Some of us are going to go to the Clyde for a drink, so open invitation to everyone to come and join us. Sabina, thank you once again for a wonderful presentation. And everyone for your questions and online, thank you very much.
See you.